She thought it was just another dusty internship in a forgotten archive. He was the heir to a pharmaceutical empire, chasing history for a centennial celebration. But buried deep in the silence of old papers was something no one was meant to find. A quiet discovery, a powerful family, a love that should never have happened. What would you choose, truth or the person you love? Subscribe now and uncover the story they tried to erase, one file at a time. The smell of brittle paper and forgotten decades lingered thick in the air, clinging to every breath Thea Wallace took. Dust danced in the shaft of morning light that slipped through the high, barred windows, catching on metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling like silent sentinels. The Philadelphia Historical Records Center was not a place that welcomed change. It creaked, it waited, it endured. And for Thea, on her first official day as an intern, it felt like stepping into a sacred cathedral of memory. She stood for a moment just past the heavy doors, clutching a leather-bound notebook against her chest, her eyes scanning the maze of shelves and rusted ladders. Everything was quiet, save for the low hum of fluorescent bulbs and the occasional flutter of paper somewhere deep within the rows. Here, voices dropped to whispers without being asked. Even her boots, sensible and flat-soled, seemed too loud on the time-worn floorboards. There was something about the silence here that felt larger than ordinary quiet. It was not the silence of neglect, but of preservation, of secrets held carefully in acid-free folders, of names no longer spoken aloud but still existing, if only in ink and parchment. She had arrived early, far too early if she were being honest with herself. She wanted time to breathe, to observe, to steady the anxious pulse in her throat. Months ago, she had stared at the acceptance letter with trembling fingers, hardly believing she had been chosen for the highly competitive archival internship. Now she stood in the middle of it, half elated, half terrified that she might never live up to what it all represented. Thea ran her hand along the edge of a nearby shelf, where labels marked decades and categories in faded handwriting. Business Archives, 1900–1930, she murmured softly. Her voice startled her in the vastness. She tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear and took a deep breath. The reading room was empty, the research tables bare save for one stack of untouched archival boxes left by a previous team. A desk lamp glowed faintly near the far corner, as though someone had forgotten to turn it off the night before. The faint ticking of a wall clock kept her company, though its hands seemed too reluctant to move. As she began walking slowly between the aisles, she felt a familiar thrill settle into her chest, the quiet joy of potential discovery. There was something deeply human in the work she was about to begin, piecing together scattered correspondence, deciphering fragile ledgers, tracing invisible connections between people who had never imagined their lives would be preserved on file. But beneath that excitement was something else, a loneliness she had not quite anticipated. There was no chatter here, no break-room laughter or shared glances across desks. The archive demanded attention but not affection. It allowed no distractions. She paused by a file drawer labeled MISC, Personal Effects 1910s, and gently pulled it open. Inside were small envelopes, some still sealed, and a yellowed photograph of a young couple in wedding attire, stiff with formality. She smiled sadly. So many lives reduced to remnants. So many stories forgotten or unfinished. Her footsteps led her to her assigned workstation, a long table marked with a small placard that read Wallace Thea. Next to it sat a wheeled cart of folders and document boxes waiting to be processed. The job was meticulous, repetitive, and rarely praised, but it was sacred in its own way, and it was hers. She slid into the chair, opened her notebook, and let out a breath she had been holding since sunrise. In the stillness, surrounded by memory, Thea Wallace quietly began. Thea had just finished labeling a box of faded shipping invoices when the double doors at the front of the archive swung open with a rush of cold outside air. She looked up instinctively, her pen still poised mid-word. The man who stepped inside looked as though he had taken a wrong turn on the way to a boardroom. He wore a tailored navy suit that did not belong in this world of dust and delicate paper. The lines were clean, severe, the fabric so fine it seemed to absorb the light. A wool coat, charcoal and heavy, hung impeccably over one arm. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked once against the old wood before he stopped, scanning the room as though unimpressed by what he saw. The silence of the archive seemed to lean away from him. Thea felt herself straighten, instinctively brushing the sleeve of her cardigan and adjusting the collar of her blouse. This man did not look like any of the visiting researchers who usually made their way into the archives. Retired professors with threadbare jackets, hobbyist historians with notebooks bursting at the seams. He moved with too much certainty, too much expectation that the world would yield to him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but precise. "I was told to speak with someone regarding archival records for Finch Pharmaceuticals, early records, pre-World War II if possible." The woman at the front desk, a longtime archivist named Miriam, looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "Do you have an appointment?" "I spoke with someone earlier this week. They said an intern could assist me today." There was a brief pause. Then, without turning her head, Miriam called out, "Thea." Heart catching in her throat, Thea rose from her seat and approached. Her boots made barely a sound compared to the sharp rhythm of his. She was suddenly aware of the ink stain on her thumb, the slight smudge on the corner of her glasses. "This is Thea Wallace," Miriam said. "She just began her internship. Bright girl, she'll help you with what you need." The man extended a hand. "Alistair Finch." Thea hesitated a fraction of a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, his palm cool. She blinked. Finch. The name had rung a faint bell, but now it struck like a bell tower. Finch Pharma, of course. One of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. The same Finch that funded medical programs and dominated news cycles when they launched a new vaccine line. And this man was the Finch. "Yes," she said quickly, almost forgetting to release his hand. "I mean, hello, I would be happy to help." "Good," he said, glancing once more at the quiet expanse of the archive. "I am looking for original documents, formation papers, early correspondence, anything from the first 2 or 3 decades. We are planning a centennial project. Family history, that sort of thing." Thea nodded, already doing mental triage. Some of those records were donated as part of the Municipal Archives business collection. They may not be indexed in a straightforward way, especially if they arrived piecemeal. "I expected as much," he replied, a hint of impatience in his tone. "That is why I thought it better to look myself." "Right. Well," she motioned toward the aisle, trying to keep her voice from wobbling. "We can start in Section C, early 20th century corporate filings. Some of it is fragile, but I will walk you through the handling process." As they made their way toward the rows of shelves, Thea stole a glance at him out of the corner of her eye. He did not walk so much as stride, his attention shifting rapidly from floor to ceiling as though evaluating the very architecture. It was clear he was used to clean lines, efficient systems, immediate results. But in this place time moved slower, dust clung, answers hid. "I should warn you," she said lightly. "Archives have a way of revealing more than you expect." He looked at her, one brow slightly raised. "That is exactly what I am hopping for." And though she did not know it then, that single sentence was the quiet opening of a door she would one day walk through and never come back the same. Thea's fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked one of the older metal cabinets, its hinges groaning like something long asleep. The drawers were heavy, stiff with age, and the folders inside bore the marks of decades, edges crumbling, paper yellowing like parchment left out in the sun. She moved carefully, sliding a few labeled folders into the top of the gray cart beside her, which already groaned under the weight of earlier boxes. One of its wheels had a troubling squeak she had meant to mention to Miriam, but the day had already gathered momentum. Alastair stood a few feet away at a work table, hunched slightly over a faded blueprint. His coat had been set aside on a chair, his sleeves rolled up just enough to suggest that, for now, he had accepted the rules of this strange, musty world. She had noticed the way he handled the documents, cautious, but not timid. There was something curious in the way he traced lines of ink with his eyes, absorbing more than he let on. "I found early board meeting minutes," she said, wheeling the cart toward him, "and an acquisitions file from—" The front wheel hit a crack in the floor with a sharp clunk. Then silence, a split second of stillness. Then came the chaos. The entire top box slid forward. Thea lunged, too late. Papers burst into the air like startled birds, cascading down in a storm of yellowed sheets, fragile correspondence, and brittle financial ledgers. The noise was strangely soft, like rain on old wood, but devastating all the same. Several sheets landed squarely across Alastair's polished shoes, and one fluttered down onto his shoulder with comedic grace. "No, no, no, no." Thea's voice was a breathless stammer as she dropped to the floor, heart pounding in mortification. "I am so sorry." She reached out for the nearest folder, only for her knee to knock against the side of the cart. Another box wobbled ominously, then tilted. She ducked just in time as it spilled a new wave of folders across the floor. Alastair took a step back, but instead of the sharp reprimand she braced for, she heard something far more unexpected, a quiet, surprised laugh. When she looked up, red-faced and clutching a stack of wildly misfiled correspondence, Alastair was grinning, an actual grin, lopsided and amused. "Well," he said dryly, brushing a fine layer of dust from his trousers, "either your cart has a vendetta against me, or the ghosts of Finch Pharma are not thrilled I am here." Thea blinked, lips parting in disbelief. "I really am sorry. That wheel has been acting up. I should have." He waved a hand, kneeling down beside her. "Stop apologizing. You are not the first person to be ambushed by history." She choked back a nervous laugh and met his gaze. For a moment, he did not look like a high-powered executive. He looked younger, lighter somehow, less contained. "It is just that usually," she murmured, "history ambushes you metaphorically." "Yes, well," he said, lifting a folder and examining it with a faint smile, "I appreciate a more dramatic approach." They both reached for the same sheet of paper, her hand brushing the back of his. Thea froze. His fingers were warm, steady. Their eyes met. It was not romance, not yet, but something shifted. The sterile air of professionalism thinned, and in its place, something smaller, quieter took root. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of curiosity that went beyond ledgers and ink. Thea cleared her throat and sat back on her heels, trying not to smile too obviously. "I will fix the cart." "Or," Alastair said, rising and holding out a page to her, "we can just assume the documents are trying to reach me faster." She laughed, full and unguarded. The echo of it lingered in the still air of the archive, strange and alive among so much silence. The visits became more frequent, though neither of them said it aloud. At first, Alastair would appear once every few days, his reason always anchored in legitimacy. Another batch of documents to review, a new question about the structure of Finch Pharma's founding, a request to cross-check timelines against municipal health records. But gradually, the pattern shifted. His appointments were no longer announced in advance. Sometimes Thea would find him already at the reading table when she arrived, sleeves rolled, a folder open before him, the same cup of black coffee, never with sugar, resting nearby. Thea tried to maintain the same careful distance, but it grew harder with each visit. He listened. He asked good questions. He had a talent for drawing out her thoughts, and not just about archival methods or document preservation, but about the stories hidden within them. Why a founder might write a letter in haste, what a torn corner or ink smudge might say about the urgency of a moment long gone. One afternoon, she found him leaning over a box labeled Unsorted Finch Correspondence, 1921–1929. He held up a faded envelope and turned it between his fingers like an object of reverence. "It is strange," he said, "seeing my family this way, through paper, through someone else's words." Thea moved closer, gently taking the envelope from him. "Strange," she agreed, "but honest. People are rarely their full selves in person, but here, on the page, they forget they might be watched." Alistair looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "That is exactly what unnerves me." She offered a faint smile. "Or what makes it beautiful?" From that moment, their conversations began to stretch beyond the archives. He asked what drew her to history in the first place. She told him about her grandfather's attic, the boxes of war letters, and how once she had read the same paragraph 50 times just to feel the rhythm of a soldier's handwriting. In turn, Alistair shared stories of his childhood, vacations that were actually corporate retreats, holidays with his father always interrupted by calls and boardroom emergencies. His laughter was different when he spoke of those things, shorter, quieter, tinged with something unspoken. One morning he arrived with a book tucked under his arm, a first-edition volume on early industrial medicine. He had found it in his grandfather's private library and thought she might like to see it. He left it on her desk without a word, but the note inside, written in clean block letters, read, "Saw this and thought of you." Thea read the inscription 3 times before slipping it back into the pages. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was polite, appreciative, curious, that the way he leaned slightly closer when she explained archival classifications was just a habit, that the way her chest warmed when she heard his voice across the stacks was simply the thrill of being taken seriously. But by the time spring light began to pour more generously through the windows of the archive, neither of them was pretending very well. His smiles lingered longer. Her laughter came more easily. When their fingers brushed over a shared sheet of paper, neither of them flinched. They were still 2 professionals, surrounded by silence and order, but something had changed. The space between them was no longer filled with formality, it was filled with anticipation. Quiet, constant, and growing. The sky had shifted into that soft gray Philadelphia war in early spring, when clouds rolled low but the air no longer bit. Outside the archive, the street was still, save for the distant rattle of a passing trolley and the rhythmic tap of footsteps on damp pavement. Thea sat on a weathered iron bench near the building's side entrance, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since lost its steam. She rarely took breaks, but today felt different. He had asked. Alistair stood beside her for a moment before sitting down without a word, the motion graceful even in the awkward space. He held his own coffee, black, as always, and looked down at the sidewalk as if it had something important to say. "I do not usually take breaks," he said after a pause. Thea glanced at him, then at his perfectly pressed coat draped over the bench's back. "Neither do I." They both sipped in silence, and for a while the moment held itself gently between them. Around them the world continued with its ordinary sounds, car doors slamming, a dog barking faintly in the distance, the hiss of wet tires. "I was not supposed to run the company," Alistair said finally. "That was my older brother's path. He studied economics, wore suits before he could drive, knew every name on the board by the time he was 16. She looked at him carefully, sensing the fragility beneath the confession. "What happened?" "He died." He said it simply, without flinching. 7 years ago, a climbing accident in Switzerland. One moment he was there and then he was not. I was still in graduate school, studying history ironically. I wanted to teach or write, something quieter. Thea's breath caught. "I am so sorry." He nodded, staring into the rim of his coffee. "Thank you. It is easier now, but back then, they expected me to step in. There was no one else. I learned fast, made mistakes faster, and by the time I found my footing, I had forgotten what the original path even looked like." "You adapted." "I surrendered." Thea turned the cup slowly in her hands, watching a drop of coffee run along its side. That is not surrender. That is responsibility. You chose to carry something for your family. Alistair looked at her then, eyes steady. I think that is what frightens me. How easily we can convince ourselves we are being noble when we are simply afraid to disappoint someone. Thea did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded map she had tucked away earlier, a century-old zoning blueprint of Philadelphia's industrial district. She unfolded it across her lap, the edges curling with memory. This, she said softly, was drawn in 1907. It was mislabeled and tucked behind shipping manifests. If I had not been looking for something else, I would never have found it. Alistair leaned closer, intrigued. What is it? It is a record of a forgotten corridor of textile mills. One of them burned down under suspicious circumstances, never investigated properly. There are rumors, lawsuits that vanished, a whistleblower no one ever found. She traced a line with her fingertip. Someday, I want to follow that trail. I want to uncover a truth buried so deep no one remembers it was ever a question. Alistair was quiet for a long moment. Why? Because the past matters, not just the grand stories, the small ones too, the silenced ones. Someone has to care enough to dig them up. He looked at her, not with the distance of a businessman surveying a curiosity, but with something softer. That, he said quietly, sounds like a kind of courage. She smiled, tucking the map away, or a kind of foolishness. Maybe they are the same. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full of respect, of understanding, of something new that neither of them had quite named yet. They sat there together, coffee cooling, maps folded, dreams exposed. And for once, the weight each of them carried did not feel quite so heavy. The air in the back corridor of the archive felt different, denser, quieter, like even time itself hesitated to pass through. Thea had wandered there during a routine reclassification of mislabeled storage, her pencil tucked behind one ear and a folder balanced against her hip. Most of the cabinets lining the walls were familiar, some half-empty, others crowded with dust-covered boxes, but one in particular caught her eye. It was taller than the others, dark green metal with a brass handle dulled by age. A strip of yellowed tape marked the top drawer in bold, faded letters, restricted. No catalog number, no cross-reference, just a word that felt less like a warning and more like a whisper. She hesitated. Officially, interns were not meant to access restricted materials without supervision. Unofficially, Miriam had once told her, if something is locked but forgotten, it is probably just waiting for the right person to notice. Thea tried the handle, locked. She bit her lip, then stepped away, returning minutes later with the ring of archive keys she had been entrusted with for cabinet audits. Most of them were labeled in code, letters and numbers scrawled in pen or half rubbed off over the years. She tried them one by one, the sound of metal on metal echoing in the narrow corridor. The fifth key turned. The drawer gave way with a reluctant creak, the scent of old paper rushing out like breath held too long. Inside were three shallow boxes, stacked unevenly, their edges lined with handwritten notes and brittle ribbon. The first box contained letters, hundreds of them bundled with string, some opened neatly, others torn with haste. The second held ledgers, each bound in worn leather, the pages heavy and yellowed. The third box was marked simply, Private, FP 1924-1932. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were handwritten notes in a slanted, urgent script. Personal memos from Frederick Percy Finch, the company's founder, and others bearing names Thea recognized from earlier corporate records, names that had appeared polished and exemplary in press releases and official timelines. But here, in these unguarded entries, the tone was different. These were not speeches or proposals. They were admissions, doubts, confessions. She sat on the floor, knees pulled close, flipping through the first letter at random. It was dated April 1926 and written in hurried graphite pencil. We cannot move forward with the current trial batch. The children at the orphanage are not responding as predicted. Henry says we risk reputational harm if this becomes public. He wants the reports burned. Thea stopped reading, her stomach churned. She read another, this one from a junior chemist. I objected again this morning. The results are clear, and yet Henry insists we reinterpret them. I fear they may simply redact and release the findings regardless. If this goes to market, I worry what we might become. She turned to the ledgers. The margins were filled with shorthand notes that did not match the clean numbers, adjustments, omissions, entire figures scratched out and rewritten with different ink. It was a quiet form of manipulation, designed not to be noticed but once seen, impossible to ignore. She closed the box slowly, heart-pounding. These were not just records. They were shadows of a truth buried with intention. She stood, legs unsteady, and returned the boxes carefully to the drawer. The cabinet closed with a heavy, deliberate sound, like a secret sealing itself shut once more. But it was too late. Thea had seen, and in the dim corridor, the silence around her felt colder than it had before. Thea returned to the restricted cabinet the next morning, this time with gloves, a notebook, an annoying sense that what she was about to uncover would change everything. She waited until the archive was at its quietest, mid-morning, when Miriam had gone for coffee and the regular researchers had settled into their routines. No one noticed her slip into the back corridor. No one asked about the key she had pocketed. The lock clicked open more easily now, as if the drawer had grown accustomed to her presence. She opened the second box, the ledgers. The ink on the first few pages had bled slightly with age, but the entries were clear. Each page chronicled shipments, supplier transactions, and trial results. But as she turned further, a pattern began to form, subtle at first, then glaring. There were double entries, inconsistent figures, and unusual expenses listed under vague labels like external negotiation or post-trial adjustment. One memo, clipped between 2 pages, stood out. Meeting with Inspector Wendell concluded. Payment accepted. All copies of the interim report have been collected. No public record remains. Proceed as planned. Thea stared at the paper, fingers cold beneath the gloves. She had studied corporate records before, had learned the language of concealment, words like adjustment and settlement that often masked something darker. But this was not cautious misreporting or the clumsy accounting of a fledgling company. This was a deliberate, calculated reshaping of truth. The letters confirmed it. In one, Frederick Percy Finch wrote to a business partner, "We cannot afford another delay. The market window is narrow, and the Germans are already testing their formulation. If we wait for the next phase of trials, we lose the lead. Release a diluted batch. Inform the board it is a pilot deployment." In another, a whistleblower, her name signed only as M.H., described internal pressure to destroy documents and rephrase test results. "I fear for my position, but I fear more for what this company is becoming," she wrote. "If this ever sees light, it will ruin us." Thea pressed her hand against her forehead, trying to breathe. These were not isolated incidents. The letters spanned years. The same names repeated: Henry Talcott, the company's first director of trials, Charles Finch, Alistair's uncle, even then pulling strings behind the scenes. The company had not just weathered a difficult beginning. It had clawed its way forward, silencing dissent, rewriting failures into successes, and building a legacy on foundations riddled with rot. She thought of Alistair, of his quiet reverence when speaking of his grandfather, of the pride in his voice when reading old mission statements aloud, thinking they still held meaning. He had no idea. The image of Finch Pharma, with its gleaming buildings and humanitarian campaigns, had been polished over a history of erasure. It was not just a matter of corporate ambition, it was exploitation. It was harm. Thea closed the final letter slowly. A name appeared on its envelope, Margaret Holt, the same initials M.H. from the whistleblower letters. There might be more. There might be a living connection. She rose, her knees stiff from sitting so long on the cold floor, her mind reeling. Every archivist dreams of discovering something forgotten. But Thea had not found a forgotten story. She had uncovered a buried one that was never meant to be unearthed. And now that she had read the truth, she could not unread it. Thea found herself watching him more carefully now. Alistair stood at his usual table near the north window, a file open before him, the afternoon light catching on the fine lines at the corner of his eyes. He was talking, almost fondly, about a photograph he had just uncovered. It showed his grandfather, Frederick Percy Finch, in a dark coat and wire-framed glasses, standing before a brick building that once housed the company's first laboratory. He was a builder, Alistair said quietly, tracing the photo's edge with one fingertip. Not just of the company, but of the belief that medicine could be equal parts business and duty. He used to say, "Profit without conscience is a house with no foundation." That quote is engraved at our headquarters now. Thea sat across from him, trying not to let her face betray the knot forming in her chest. She had spent the previous evening rereading every letter from the restricted cabinet, committing details to memory. Each line had etched itself deeper into her mind, until the stories began to bleed into each other. Trial data altered, payments made in silence, a product launched against better judgment. And now here was Alistair, his voice calm, eyes softened with something close to reverence. "My father talks about him constantly," he continued, his tone laced with pride. "How he never asked anyone to do work he was not willing to do himself. I suppose I held on to that, especially in the beginning, when everything felt too big." Thea forced a smile, her fingers curled around her coffee cup like it might anchor her to the table. "Did you ever meet him?" "Once. I was maybe 5. He was already sick by then. I do not remember his voice, only the way everyone changed when he entered a room, like the volume of the world turned down." She tried to picture the man as Alistair described him, visionary, grounded, principled. But the image refused to match the man in the letters, the one who had ordered a trial moved forward despite warnings, who had written, "Let the market judge, not the lab." "I think I wanted to be like him," Alistair added, his eyes distant now. "Not in what he built, but how he carried it." Thea's throat tightened. She did not know how to tell him. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Every instinct within her screamed that he deserved to know, but the weight of that knowledge would not fall only on him. It would fall on his legacy, on his name, on the thing he had spent years trying to preserve. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the people we admire are more complicated than the stories we are told." Alistair smiled faintly. "Of course, but that does not make the stories useless. It just means we have to be brave enough to keep listening, even when they surprise us." She nodded, not trusting her voice. As he turned back to the folder, lost in old letters and photographs, Thea sat frozen. The man across from her was sincere, thoughtful, and kind, and she was holding a truth that could shatter the foundation of everything he believed in, not just about his company, but about the man whose footsteps he had followed. Her guilt grew quietly, steadily. It did not roar. It whispered. It whispered with every click of her pen, every rustle of paper, every moment his eyes lit up at some fragment of family history. And with each whisper, it asked the same unrelenting question. When would she tell him? The first time Thea heard Charles Finch's name spoken aloud, it came with laughter. Alistair had returned to the archive later than usual that day, shaking off a light drizzle as he stepped inside. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him. Dark sweater, no tie, damp curls slightly mussed by the wind. In his hand, he carried a newspaper folded under one arm and an espresso cup still steaming faintly. "Morning meeting was worse than expected," he said, half sighing, as he joined her at the work table. Charles was in one of his moods again. Thea looked up from a set of early 1930s financials, blinking. Charles. My uncle, chairman of the board. He has this way of making everything sound like a threat, even when he is congratulating you. Alistair smiled, though there was little warmth in it. He sees ghosts in every corner, thinks every minor deviation from tradition is the first step toward ruin. Thea returned his smile, masking the quick flicker of recognition the name triggered. She had seen it, see Finch, dozens of times over the past few days, scribbled in margins, initialed on memos that reeked of compromise and careful omission. After Alistair left, Thea stayed behind, long after the others had powered down their terminals and vanished into the dusk. She pulled out the restricted box once more, spreading its contents with the precision of someone performing surgery. Charles Finch, the name surfaced again and again. In a typed letter from 1928, Charles, then only a junior administrator, had advocated fiercely for the suppression of preliminary trial data. His language was cold, tactical. The data set in question, if released, will erode shareholder confidence. We recommend neutralizing the narrative. Full deletion of test phase B is necessary for public-facing reports. Another note, handwritten in the margins of a contract draft, read simply, "If we delay until after quarterly earnings, the board will be easier to manage." Thea leaned back, her chair creaking softly beneath her. This was not just youthful ambition or corporate callousness. It was systemic, strategic, and most disturbing of all, Charles was still there, sitting at the head of the table decades later, shaping policies, issuing directives, perhaps still guarding the truth they had buried so long ago. The next day she pulled up internal press releases and company bios. Charles Finch had been with Finch Pharma for over 50 years, a titan of continuity, the steward of legacy. He was often described in glowing terms, a keeper of the flame, a voice of corporate memory. Yet in the shadows of the archive, he appeared not as a guardian but as the architect of silence. That evening, Thea stared at her reflection in the glass doors before leaving, her thoughts looping restlessly. Charles was not a ghost. He was still breathing, still speaking in boardrooms, still guiding the story that Alistair believed was true. The same man who had once insisted that whistleblowers be isolated and retired, who had marked ethical deviation as internal volatility in memos now preserved only by accident. Her hands trembled as she returned the folders to their box. For the first time since uncovering the truth, she felt real fear, not for herself, but for what this knowledge could mean for Alistair, for what it might cost him to know that the uncle he had trusted, perhaps even loved, had been the silent puppeteer behind decades of deception. And worse, that the truth had been sitting quietly in a cabinet just 2 corridors away, waiting for someone like her to bring it to light. Thea could not sleep. Each night, after returning to her apartment with its quiet lamps and tidy bookshelves, she found herself drifting through the motions of normal life, making tea, rereading old articles, staring blankly at the walls. But her mind stayed locked in that dim corridor, surrounded by the scent of old paper and truths never meant to surface. The documents haunted her, not because of their age but because of what they represented, a long, deliberate silencing of harm, orchestrated by names still etched into plaques and praised in speeches. She thought of Charles Finch's tidy signature beneath a memorandum recommending the destruction of internal trial summaries. Limit exposure, reroute accountability through procedural ambiguity. The language was pristine, calculated, antiseptic in its cruelty. And then there was Alistair. She remembered the way his voice softened when he spoke of family, of the values passed down. He believed in what he was building, not just as a businessman but as a man trying genuinely to do good. His grandfather, his uncle, even the company itself had been pillars of purpose for him, foundations beneath the weight of legacy and duty. If she told him what she knew, that weight would crack. The ground would shift. But if she stayed silent, if she did what Charles had done, she would become part of the lie. Her training as an archivist had been clear. The profession demanded integrity, detachment, truth. Do not alter. Do not obscure. Do not bury. She had once repeated those words like a litany before exams. But now, faced with their living cost, they felt less like rules and more like a dare. By the end of the week, she began collecting evidence in secret. Late in the afternoons, after the researchers had gone and the lights had dimmed, Thea returned to the restricted drawer. She scanned key documents, noting page numbers, signatures, cross-references. She began drafting a private index in her notebook, code names for each folder, so that even if someone glanced over her shoulder, the meaning would remain hidden. She found duplicate copies of company reports with subtle discrepancies, a marketing plan written months before product approval, a speech declaring trial success, dated weeks before any final analysis had been recorded. Everything pointed to one truth. The story Finch Pharma had built, one Alistair had inherited, was not only flawed, it was engineered. She kept the pages locked in her drawer, hidden beneath folders marked with municipal codes no one had touched in years. She slept less, smiled less. When Alistair stopped by, she answered his questions with care, never quite meeting his eyes for too long. Each time he laughed or reached across the table to show her some newly discovered photograph, a knot tightened in her chest. He trusted her. He saw her as someone who believed in history the way he did, in its power to shape better futures. But how could she be that person now, knowing what she knew? One evening after he had left, Thea stood at the edge of the reading room, her gaze fixed on the dim hallway beyond. She whispered to the quiet, "How do you tell someone that everything they believe in was built on a lie?" The shelves offered no answer, only silence, and the soft, unrelenting weight of paper pressing down from all sides. The encounter came without warning. It was a Thursday morning, gray and brisk, and Thea had just returned from the city archive annex with a bundle of cross-referenced files tucked under her arm. She entered the reading room to find Miriam in whispered conversation with a sharply dressed man, older, tall, and exacting in posture. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and a heavy gold ring glinted on his right hand as he adjusted the sleeve of his overcoat. Though she had never met him before, Thea knew immediately who he was. Charles Finch. He turned the moment she crossed the threshold, his gaze finding her with unsettling precision. There was something unreadable in his expression, not unkind, but too measured, as if he were already cataloging her. "You must be Thea Wallace," he said, his tone smooth. "My nephew speaks highly of you." Her fingers tightened around the file bundle. "Yes, sir. I am assisting with the archival research on Finch Pharma's early history." "Yes, I understand you have been quite thorough." He stepped forward, not so much looming as quietly encroaching. "It is admirable, really. Attention to detail is what preserves legacy, though one must also know which details are, well, best left in the dust." Thea forced herself to hold his gaze. "My work is guided by professional ethics, sir. I follow where the documents lead." "Of course," he said, smiling without warmth. "And sometimes the documents lead us somewhere unproductive or potentially harmful to living people, to institutions still doing good work." There was no need for pretense. His voice was calm, but the message landed with precision. "I am simply saying," Charles continued, "that context matters, motive matters. A misread document from a century ago, pulled into the wrong light, can cast shadows that were never meant to fall." Thea's pulse thudded in her ears. He gave a small, almost courteous nod. "I trust you will remember that, Miss Wallace." With that, he turned to Miriam, exchanged a few polite words, and exited without haste, like a man confident that a single nudge was all it took to change the course of things. Thea stood motionless long after he left. Her skin felt chilled, her hands damp with sweat. The threat had been veiled, yes, but it had teeth. And worse, it came with an unmistakable implication. She was being watched. That afternoon, she barely spoke. When Alistair arrived unexpectedly with a fresh set of bound reports and 2 coffees, one for her just the way she liked it, she did her best to seem normal. But her smiles were thinner, her attention fragmented. Her eyes darted to doorways, to windows, to shadows between the shelves. "You seem somewhere else today," Alistair said, his voice careful. Thea looked up, startled, and then quickly looked away. "Just tired. The city annex was a mess. Dust, mold, misfiled records, nothing worth talking about." He tilted his head slightly. "You are not usually this vague." She gave a small shrug, trying not to let the panic rise. "It is nothing." But it was not nothing. He could feel it, the quiet wall rising between them. The way she no longer met him in the corridor when he arrived. The way her fingers curled protectively over her notebook. There was a distance now, invisible but absolute. Alistair left earlier than usual that day, leaving his coffee half-finished. And as the doors closed behind him, Thea sat frozen at the long reading table, a growing ache pressing against her ribs. She had always believed that truth was worth the cost. But what if the cost was him? What if, by exposing the past, she lost the one person who had ever made her feel seen, not as a tool, not as an intern, but as someone whose voice carried weight? The silence in the archive was no longer comforting. It was waiting. And for the first time since she had arrived, Thea was afraid of what it might be waiting for. The confrontation came not with anger, but with quiet insistence. It was late, near closing. Thea had stayed behind again, poring over yet another ledger that whispered what no press release ever would. The room was still, lit only by a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the table. She did not hear the footsteps until they stopped behind her. "I waited," Alistair said softly, "but I am done waiting." Thea turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, coat unbuttoned, eyes dark with something she had never seen in them before, not fury, but sorrow worn thin into determination. "I have been asking myself all week why you are pulling away from me," he continued. "And I think I already know, but I want to hear it from you. I deserve that much." Thea opened her mouth, then closed it. Her throat burned. "I found them," she said finally. "The restricted files, the letters, the ledgers, all of it." Alistair's breath caught, but he did not speak. "I did not mean to find them at first," she went on. "But once I did, I could not stop. It was all there, trial records, bribed inspectors, falsified reports. From the very beginning, your company was built on silence, on harm swept neatly beneath decades of public good." His jaw clenched, but his voice remained even. "You should have told me." "I wanted to, I was going to, but then your uncle came." That gave him pause. "Charles." She nodded. "He found out, I do not know how, he warned me. Nicely, of course. Polite threats wrapped in legacy and loyalty." Alistair looked away, jaw tight. "That sounds like him." Thea watched him closely. "You knew?" "No," he said. "Not this. Not details. But I have always known there were parts of the past we did not speak about. I was told it was for clarity, for progress, that history was best preserved clean." He turned to her fully now, eyes shining, not with tears but something colder, deeper. "But you read the documents. You read his words, my grandfather." "I did." "Was it all true?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." Alistair stepped back, like her confirmation had struck him physically. He ran a hand through his hair, then paced a few steps away before turning back to her. "Do you know what it means," he said, voice low, "to have built your life on a legacy you thought was honorable? To look in the mirror and wonder if your name carries harm instead of hope?" Thea stood, unable to remain seated in the heaviness of the moment. "I am sorry. I did not want to hurt you." "But you did," he said, not unkindly. "Because you had to, and I do not blame you for that." Silence fell between them, dense and fragile. "I do not know what I am supposed to do now," he said quietly. "This company, it is more than a business. It is my family, my history, But if this is the truth, then maybe it was never ours to begin with. She stepped toward him. You are not your grandfather, you are not Charles, you have a choice. He looked at her for a long time, something breaking quietly behind his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, shoulders heavy, footsteps uneven, the truth trailing after him like smoke. Thea stood alone in the quiet archive, her heart heavy, her hands trembling. The fracture had come, not with fury but with revelation, and she had no idea if anything on the other side could be salvaged. Rain blurred the windows of the archive the following afternoon, streaking the glass in thin silver trails. Thea sat at her usual table, but the folders before her remained unopened. Her thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in the echo of Alistair's voice from the night before, in the haunted look he had given her as if some part of him had fractured beyond repair. He did not come that day, nor the next. On the third day, just as she was about to leave early, she saw him waiting near the side entrance, leaning against the cold stone wall with his coat collar turned up, eyes trained on the ground. Thea hesitated, then stepped into the drizzle, her breath catching when he looked up and offered a weary nod. "Do you want to walk?" he asked, voice quiet. She nodded. They walked in silence along the narrow path that bordered the archive's outer courtyard, their footsteps muffled by damp leaves. It was not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the strained silence of two people trying to find footing where none had existed before. Finally, Alistair spoke. "I read the notes you left in the folder," he said. "The summaries, your cross-references." "I did not want you to be unprepared," Thea said. "Not after." "I know," he interrupted, not unkindly. "You gave me the truth, and I am grateful, even if it does not seem that way." He paused beside a low wrought-iron fence, glancing toward the brick skyline where his company's headquarters loomed in the near distance. Then he exhaled, slow and uneven. "I keep thinking about my father," he said. "About the way he talked about the early years like they were sacred. He believed in what we built. So did I." "I think you still can," Thea said gently, "but maybe not in the way you were taught to." He turned to her then, and something in his eyes made her chest tighten. It was not anger, it was loss. "I want to believe that," he said. "I want to believe you, but I have spent my whole life learning to defend my family before I even understand what they have done. That kind of loyalty, it sinks deep, and I do not know how to unravel it overnight." Thea's hands clenched at her sides. "You do not have to choose between truth and legacy, but you do have to stop pretending they are the same." Alistair flinched, then nodded slowly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "I know. That is why I need space, Thea. Not because I do not trust you, but because I cannot hear anyone else's voice while I am still trying to remember what my own sounds like." The words hit harder than she expected. Her throat burned with unspoken protest, but she swallowed it down. "I understand," she said, and somehow it was true. He took a step back, as though the distance mattered, as though it might keep everything from crumbling further. "I do not know what I will do next," he admitted. "But when I do, I want to know it came from me. Not my name, not my family, me." She nodded, unable to speak. Alistair turned then, rain glancing off his shoulders as he walked back down the path. He did not look back. Thea remained in place, cold seeping through her coat, her heart heavier than she had known it could be. She had given him the truth, but it had come at the cost of their closeness, their trust. And now all she could do was wait, hoping that space would not become distance, and that silence might still carry something like hope. Rain became a constant companion in the days that followed. It pattered against the tall windows of the archive like a clock without rhythm, drawing long streaks down the glass, softening the city outside into a watercolor of gray and shadow. Inside, Thea buried herself in silence and paper. Alistair's absence echoed louder than any presence. She felt it in the space he used to occupy beside her, in the untouched chair, the ghost of half-finished conversations lingering in the air. But she did not let herself linger there. Instead, she returned to the cabinet, to the letters, to the voices that had been buried far longer than any truth between them. She had gone back to a name. MH. The initials had appeared in multiple documents, always tucked into margins or signed at the bottom of handwritten notes. The writing was precise, clean, and yet filled with urgency. She was determined to know who MH was, this quiet voice echoing across a century, someone who had tried to speak when it mattered most. It was in a misfiled envelope, behind a set of unrelated company blueprints, that she found it. A letter, unsent, still sealed with a faded wax insignia bearing the early Finch Pharma crest. She opened it with the delicate care of someone, lifting the lid of a long-forgotten grave. To whom it may one day concern. My name is Margaret Holt. I have worked under Frederick Finch's laboratory division since 1921. What I am writing now may never be read, or if it is, may be dismissed. But I can no longer pretend silence is safety. The letter unfolded in trembling words, Margaret's confession of altered trial results, of pressure to lie on medical outcomes, of watching colleagues dismissed quietly after raising concern. She described a trial at a rural children's facility where adverse effects were underreported. She named names, Charles Finch's name among them. They believe because I am a woman and a clerk, I am a vessel and not a witness, but I have seen everything. Thea sat for hours, reading every sentence, copying the words into her own journal until they pulsed like veins beneath her fingertips. Margaret had tried. She had spoken, written, documented, but her voice had been sealed away, intentionally misplaced, forgotten by design. And now, nearly 100 years later, Thea was the first to read her words with the gravity they deserved. It felt like a kind of kinship, not just because of what they had uncovered, but because of what they had risked. Thea looked at the final line. If no one ever reads this, then I will have still done what I could. But if someone does, please do not let them rewrite us. She closed her notebook slowly, her throat tight. Margaret had not simply left behind a confession. She had left a torch, buried in the dark. And now Thea carried it. She placed the letter in a protective sleeve, labeling it carefully. Her hands no longer trembled. In the quiet of the archive, she did not feel alone. For the first time since Alistair had walked away, she felt sure of something. This was not just about a company or a family. This was about truth, about the people who had tried to speak it before and had been buried instead. And Thea Wallace would not let them be forgotten. The boardroom at Finch Pharma was glass and steel and silence. It hovered high above the city, a pristine chamber with an unobstructed view of everything below, skyscrapers, traffic veins, the river slicing through gray. Alistair stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching the world without really seeing it. The city moved, indifferent, but inside him everything had stopped. Charles entered without knocking. He moved with the assurance of a man who had spent his life being obeyed. His coat was immaculate, his cufflinks understated but unmistakably expensive. He closed the door behind him with a soft click. "You asked for privacy," Charles said smoothly. "I assume this is about the girl." Alistair turned. His voice, when it came, was quieter than he expected, but it held. "No, this is about you." Charles's face did not change, though his posture shifted, slightly more guarded. "Go on." Alistair stepped away from the window. His father's old chair waited at the head of the long table, but he did not take it. He stayed standing, as if to remind himself that he was not here to perform tradition. He was here to challenge it. "I have read the files," he said. "The restricted records, the memos, the letters. I know what you did, what they did." Charles gave a quiet sigh. "Alistair, legacy is rarely clean. We do what we must to survive in business. Every founder cuts corners. Every dynasty has a secret cellar. Do not talk to me like I am a child." I am talking to you like a man who understands the weight of inheritance, Charles said, voice tightening. You think you are the first to flinch at what built this company. Your father knew. So did your grandfather. Alistair's breath caught. You told me Frederick was a man of principle. He was, and when principle stood in the way of survival, he compromised, quietly. Like any man who understands scale. We are not saints, Alistair. We are custodians. History is not pure, it is useful. Alistair took a step forward. You falsified reports, bribed officials, silenced whistleblowers. These were not accidents, they were choices. Charles's jaw set just slightly. And because of those choices, the company endured, thrived, employed thousands, funded research, built hospitals. You stand in that building because we made the hard calls. At what cost? Alistair said. His voice cracked, but he did not care. Children were harmed, trials were faked. You buried the truth and built a monument on it. Charles crossed the room slowly, placing one hand on the back of a leather chair. And now what? You want to burn it all down for the sake of moral clarity, for the sake of a clever intern who read a few too many dusty letters. Alistair's eyes narrowed. Do not speak about her. Why not? She is the one who has poisoned your certainty. Charles smiled, cool and deliberate. I warned her, thought she had the sense to let ghosts stay buried. Alistair stared at him. In that moment he saw not a patriarch, not a mentor, not even family, but a man who had spent a lifetime mistaking silence for wisdom. I am not like you, Alistair said, his voice steady now. I do not want to carry this legacy if it means lying for the rest of my life. Charles studied him. Then you had better prepare for consequences. Truth, once exposed, cannot be managed. It devours. Alistair nodded once slowly. So be it. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, the glass doors sliding shut behind him. Outside, the city remained, loud, indifferent, real. For the first time in years, he felt its noise. He stood on the pavement below minutes later, the air sharp with approaching rain, and looked up at the name carved into the building. Finch. He had spent his life trying to honor it. Now he would begin again, not as its heir but as its reckoning. The auditorium was packed, though it had not been a traditional press invitation. There had been no grand unveiling, no publicist-sculpted preview, just a terse announcement from Finch Pharma's media office, statement from CEO Alistair Finch regarding archival findings. The phrasing was plain, even forgettable, but within hours curiosity surged. Whispers spread. Something unusual was happening. The stage was bare but for a single lectern beneath the company's crest, 3 intertwining circles, once meant to symbolize innovation, trust, and legacy. Beneath them, Alistair stood alone. He wore no tie. His sleeves were rolled, his hair slightly disheveled from the spring wind outside. For a long moment he looked out at the crowd, reporters, stakeholders, employees, skeptics, and said nothing. Then he began. There are moments in a company's life when silence becomes betrayal. His voice was calm, clear, the room stilled. In recent weeks, while preparing materials for our centennial project, we uncovered internal records from the early decades of Finch Pharmaceuticals. What began as a historical exercise quickly turned into something more difficult and more necessary. A murmur rippled through the room, but he did not pause. These documents reveal that, in the 1920s and 1930s, certain members of our founding leadership engaged in practices that violated both ethical and legal boundaries. There were clinical trials conducted without proper consent, trial results falsified, whistleblowers ignored or quietly removed. All of this was hidden, rewritten, and eventually erased from public view. He looked up, eyes scanning the room. I am not here to defend it. I am here to admit it. The silence that followed was sharp. I was raised on the legacy of this company. I believed in the stories told to me, of my grandfather, of the noble beginnings, of the sacrifices made to bring medicine to those in need. But history is not only what we inherit, it is what we choose to carry forward or leave behind. He took a breath, then reached for a folded sheet of paper. There was one voice we found, buried deep in those files, a clerk named Margaret Holt. In 1928, she documented her concerns in letters no one was ever meant to read. She spoke clearly about the harm she witnessed, about the pressure to remain silent, and about the fear that telling the truth would cost her everything. Alastair paused, then unfolded the page. "I want to read you the last words she wrote. If no one ever reads this, then I will have still done what I could. But if someone does, please do not let them rewrite us." His voice caught slightly on the final word, but he steadied. "In honor of Margaret Holt and every voice silenced in the margins of history, we are launching a new internal initiative, the Holt Ethics Foundation. Its mandate will be full transparency in clinical trials, external audits of our past and present practices, and support for whistleblowers within the pharmaceutical sector, ours and beyond." Cameras flashed, pens scratched furiously across notepads, but no one interrupted him. "We will open our archives to independent review. We will tell the full story of Finch Pharma, not just the polished version. We will not ask for forgiveness. We will earn it, one honest step at a time." The room held its breath. Alastair looked out at the faces before him, some stunned, some skeptical, some moved, and gave the faintest nod. This is not the end of a legacy. It is the beginning of a new one. Then he stepped down from the lectern, not to applause but to silence, deep, echoing, and full of something rare. Truth. Thea was alone in the north wing, her desk a quiet island amid towering shelves. The early morning sun slanted through the tall windows, gilding dust motes in the air. She had spent the past hour cataloging trial reports from the 1950s, letting the rhythm of the work calm the restlessness still lingering in her chest. The press conference had aired 2 days ago. She had watched it from home, huddled on her small couch, a blanket tucked around her knees and her laptop screen glowing faintly in the dim room. Alastair's voice had steadied as he spoke, but there had been a tremor beneath it, one she recognized not as fear but resolve. She had not cried until he read Margaret Holt's letter. Now the building creaked gently around her, its familiar quiet soothing unchanging, until she heard footsteps, heavy, measured, deliberate. She looked up. Alastair stood at the far end of the aisle, his coat folded over one arm, his expression unreadable at first. He looked tired, but not undone. There was something steadier in his eyes, something earned. They stood in silence for a beat, the soft hum of overhead lights filling the space between them. Then he walked toward her. Thea rose slowly, unsure what to expect, but when he reached her, he did not speak right away. He set his coat on the edge of the table, looked around the archive, this place where so much had unraveled, and then finally met her gaze. "I came to thank you," he said. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "Not just for the documents," he continued. "Not even for the truth, though that matters more than I can say. I want to thank you for something harder. You believed I could face it, even when I did not." Thea swallowed, her throat tight. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly, "afraid of what it would mean, of what I would become without the version of the past I had clung to, and I pushed you away for it." "You needed space," she said softly. "I needed courage," he corrected, "and you gave it to me whether you meant to or not." She looked down at the folder still resting open on her desk. Margaret Holt's name was scrawled at the top in her own hand, underlined in pencil. She was brave first. "And you brought her back," Alastair said. "You gave her voice again." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope, placing it gently on the table. Thea opened it and found a formal invitation, letterpress, elegant but simple. Exhibit opening, Truth in the Margins, The Hidden Voices of Finch Pharma, featuring selections curated by Thea Wallace, hosted by the Holt Ethics Foundation. She looked up, startled. "You did not have to." "Yes," he said, interrupting gently. "I did." Silence stretched again, but it was a different kind now. Not distance, but stillness, clarity. "I do not know what comes next," he said. "For the company, for any of this. But I know one thing, I do not want to rebuild it alone." Her heart tightened. "Are you sure?" He smiled, faint but real. "I have never been more sure of anything." She exhaled slowly, a tension she had carried for weeks slipping from her shoulders. And in the quiet that followed, she reached for his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, but like a memory returned to its rightful place. He held it, not as a promise but as a beginning. They did not announce anything. There were no declarations, no sudden changes, no dramatic pauses between shelves or sweeping gestures beneath the stained glass windows of the reading room. Instead, their beginning came quietly, like most real things do. They resumed their work, side by side at the long wooden table, sorting papers and sifting through timelines, but the air between them had shifted. There was no longer hesitation in the way Thea glanced up when Alistair leaned over to examine a document. No more guarded silence when their fingers brushed reaching for the same envelope. What had once been charged with uncertainty was now warm with ease. Alistair no longer brought coffee as a polite gesture. He brought it the way people bring something remembered, without asking, without comment, simply placing the cup beside her hand as if it had always belonged there. One afternoon, when the sun turned the metal shelves to gold and the scent of paper filled the room like incense, Thea looked up and found him watching her, not intensely, not expectantly, just present. "What?" she asked, a smile touching her lips. He shrugged, "Just wondering how many lives you have touched without knowing." She arched an eyebrow. That is a heavy thing to say to someone covered in dust and sorting box labels. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "Maybe, but truth has weight. You carry it well." She did not respond right away. Instead, she turned back to the file in front of her, Margaret Holt's final correspondence, now catalogued, preserved, and soon to be displayed for the public. She traced the edge of the page thoughtfully. "I do not want this to be about saving anything," she said. "Not you, not the company, just seeing things clearly, together." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "It never was about saving," he said. "It was about choosing, and I choose this, whatever it is, whoever we are." They left the archive together that evening, the sky burnished copper and lavender. Alistair offered his umbrella, though the rain had stopped. Thea took it anyway. No one watching them would have guessed what they had walked through, truths uncovered, names unmasked, histories rewritten. But in the hush of the street, in the sound of shoes against pavement and the soft murmur of their voices blending in the dusk, there was something steady. They were no longer the archivist and the heir, no longer the girl who unearthed scandal and the man who bore its name. They were simply two people, and they had chosen each other, not in spite of the dust and silence, but because of it, because they had seen what history could bury and decided to build something honest in its place. The gallery space inside the Philadelphia Historical Museum had never felt quite so alive. Beneath the soft pool of lights, the walls were lined with carefully restored documents, enlarged letter facsimiles, and crisp black and white photographs. In the center of the room stood a long glass case, inside of which rested a single folded letter, the original words of Margaret Holt, preserved at last in full view. Visitors moved slowly through the exhibit, their steps quiet, their conversations hushed as if in reverence. Some paused to read every word, others to study the faces in old company portraits, now accompanied by revised captions that told fuller, more complicated truths. The name of the exhibit, Forgotten Voices in Corporate History, was embossed in gold along the entrance wall, beneath which a smaller line had been added, almost humbly, curated by Thea Wallace. Thea stood a few paces back from the flow of guests, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She wore a soft navy dress and a simple chain at her neck. There was no microphone in her hand, no announcement to make. Her work had already spoken. She had spent months assembling the exhibit, not just collecting materials but negotiating permissions, arguing with cautious museum directors, poring over every word to be printed, every image to be displayed. She had insisted on accuracy without sensationalism, emotion without indulgence. She wanted the truth to breathe. And now it did. Alistair stood beside her, his suit dark, his presence quiet. He had said little all evening, only nodding to those who approached, occasionally answering questions from a cautious guest or corporate historian. But most of the time he stayed beside Thea, his hand finding hers when no one was looking. She had not asked him to be here. He had not asked if he could come. He simply arrived as he always did now, with no pretenses, no armor. "People are reading the letters," Thea said softly, watching a young couple lean over a transcript of internal memos from 1931. "Really reading them." "They deserve to be read," Alistair replied, "and you made that possible." She glanced up at him. "So did you." He shook his head. "No, I just stopped standing in the way." They both turned toward the central display. Margaret's letter sat beneath a carefully lit plaque with her name engraved for the first time in public record. Her words, once buried beneath nearly a century of silence, were now framed in clarity. A young girl stopped to read them, no older than Thea had been when she first dreamed of uncovering forgotten truths. She mouthed the final line under her breath, then looked up at the image of Margaret beside the glass. A studio portrait, grainy and soft, but unmistakably fierce in the eyes. The girl stood taller before walking on. Thea felt something settle inside her, a quiet, slow triumph. Not loud, not sharp, just right. As the last of the visitors trickled out and the lights began to dim, Alistair leaned closer and said, "She would have been proud." Thea did not need to ask who. She smiled, gently squeezed his hand, and replied, "So would your grandfather. If he had been the man you thought he was, maybe he would have chosen this too." Alistair nodded. "But he did not, I did." Outside, the city waited in its usual rush and blur, but inside that room something had changed. Not the past, it remained what it was, but the telling of it had been reclaimed. And Thea Wallace had made sure that this time, no one would rewrite them. The archive was quiet again. Not the heavy, inert silence of before, but a gentler kind, alive with memory, softened by the passing of time. Late afternoon light poured in through the high windows, bathing the shelves in gold. Somewhere deeper in the building, a box thudded closed. A door clicked shut. But here, in the center of the reading room, there was only stillness. Thea stood before a new display case, one of her own making. Inside lay a curated selection of documents from the Finch Pharma collection, ledgers with notes in the margins, correspondence once hidden in drawers, and a copy of Margaret Holt's letter printed on linen paper, its original locked safely in preservation storage. The placard beside it read simply, "This history was once buried. Now it belongs to everyone." She traced the edge of the glass with her fingertip, not quite touching. This was what she had always hoped for, not acclaim, not victory, but clarity. The past in full view, unvarnished, real. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow, familiar. She did not turn. Alistair stopped beside her and said nothing. He slid his hand into hers with the quiet ease of routine, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. They stood like that, side by side, two figures reflected faintly in the glass. They did not speak of the months that had passed, of board meetings transformed, of the quiet structural shifts rippling through a company once shielded in myth. They did not speak of the articles or the academic panel that now cited Margaret Holt's name with reverence. They did not speak of the nights spent reworking the exhibition script, or the mornings shared over coffee and silence. They did not need to. Thea turned to him, her head tilting just slightly. "You are still here." He looked at her with a soft smile. So are you. Outside the city buzzed, trolleys, voices, the churn of the world pressing on. But here, in this sanctuary of dust and ink, two people stood in the stillness they had once feared. They had chosen each other not in defiance of the past, but because of it. Because love, like truth, endures best when it is honest, when it is quiet, when it is earned. Thea rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, her hand still in his. The archive, once a vault of forgotten names, now held something more: testament, reckoning, resilience. And in that quiet room, beneath shelves heavy with memory, time and love remained. Preserved,